All right, we are going to read chapter 9 of Devil's Bridge. And if you remember, he had just snuck out of his house. So we don't really know what he's doing, but he knows that this is not fair and he wants to go fix it. So chapter 9, the night was clear and the moon was just one day from being full. So I could see pretty well as I pedaled hard down the Lobsterville Beach Road. Cars and jeeps belonging to fishermen were parked all along the beach, and over the low dunes, I could see the lights from their lanterns. The road ended at West Basin, where twice a day the tide flowed from the sea through a narrow channel into a huge saltwater pond and back again. On the other side of the channel was Menemsha Harbor. That was where the big fishing boats, including the Aquanaut, docked. I didn't have a plan, but Freddie Cobb worked on the Aquanaut, and sometimes the crews from the commercial boats would hang around at the docks, playing cards and telling stories. If Freddie was there, I'd find him. I stashed my bike in the tangle of beach plums and searched the row of overturned dinghies on the shore, looking for the one that belonged to Jeff's father. Quickly, I turned it right side up, dragged it down to the water, stepped in, and began to row. Hard. The tide was still coming in through the narrow channel and up into the pond. I had crossed the channel many times and knew that I had to row not only across, but against the tide. The channel was always treacherous, but especially on the outgoing tide. What a mistake meant you would be swept out into the open waters of Vineyard Sound. There were still some fishermen casting from the stone jetties on the other side of the channel, and I was careful to stay away from their lures. Sweating from exertion, I pulled the boat up onto the Menemsha shore above the high tide mark. I didn't think I'd be very long, but I knew better than to leave the boat where the tide could reach it. It was something Pop had taught me when I was just a little kid. I walked along the dock past the big luxury boats belonging to the tourists and into the lighted area of Squid Row. The bait shop was closed, but Pete Vanderhoop, the harbor master, was sitting on the bench outside. "Ben Daggett, is that you?" he called. "Hi, Pete. It's me, all right," I answered. "Where were you today?" he asked. "The albacore were in the channel thick as mullet. Bonito, too." Usually that news would have perked me right up. Albies and bonito were really fun to catch, but I had other things on my mind. "Is the Aquanaut around?" I asked. "Right in her usual berth," answered Pete. He looked at me curiously. "Why?" "I'm looking for Freddie Cobb," I said, trying to sound casual. "Freddie's a mighty popular fellow tonight," Pete observed, holding a match to his pipe. I stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "You're the third person who's come looking for Freddie," said Pete. "Who else?" I asked. Pete shrugged. "Didn't know either of them. I guess," he said, "guess Freddie's a real celebrity now that he caught himself a big fish." I scowled. "Right." "Too bad, Ben," said Pete, "about your father's record, I mean. I heard Freddie's fish was bigger." "Don't be too sure about that, Pete," I said, and I walked away before I could say anything else. I headed down the dock to where the commercial boats rocked in their berths like huge resting whales. These weren't pleasure boats, but hard-working iron giants smelling pungently of fish and tar and diesel fuel. There were no lights here, and the moon had passed behind a cloud. In the dark shadows, I saw strange ships that made my heart start to flutter. "That's just an oil drum," I told myself. "And that's a pile of lobster traps. Come on, you've been here 100 times before." Ahead, I could see the outline of the Aquanaut looking dark and deserted in its place at the end of the pier. "You dope," I told myself. "Freddie's not here. No one's here. What did you think you were going to do anyway? Catch him red-handed with the fish and make him confess? Make him apologize?" I almost laughed out loud at my foolishness. Approaching the Aquanaut, I looked for a light below decks, or for any sign of life. Nothing. I was about to turn and leave when I saw the red glow of a cigarette near the stern. I stared while the cigarette moved and burned brighter as someone took a long, slow drag. For a moment, I could see the features of the smoker's face, but not well enough to recognize them. Sitting in the dark, whoever it was must have seen me and heard me coming, but he didn't speak. There was something creepy about the way he sat there watching me, not saying a word. I decided to take a chance. "Freddie," I called. There was a long pause, then a low voice growled, "Who wants to know?" The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Some instinct warned me not to say my name. "Just a friend," I said quickly and turned to go. I saw the cigarette fly overboard and heard it hit the water with a hiss. Then a dark shadow emerged from the other shadows on deck and began moving toward me, fast. I began to run. A hand grabbed the hood of my windbreaker, and the nylon pulled against my throat, choking me. I stopped running and turned to see the big man who'd been at the beach with Freddie still holding on to my hood. I didn't speak as he looked me over carefully. You, he said in that same low growl. Just a friend, eh? From what I hear, you've been trying to cause a little trouble for Freddie. Now that's not what I'd call being friendly, would you? He pulled my facer closer to his. Well, would you? You cheater, I shouted. Let go of me. You're not stupid, are you? You're not going to mess things up for our friend Freddie now, are you? He asked in a quiet voice that was worse than any shout. Because if you are... Let go, I said again, and at the same time, I brought the heel of my sneaker down hard on the arch of his foot. Taking advantage of his surprise and pain, I wiggled free of his grasp and began to run down the dock toward the lights at Squid Row. You little... Heavy footsteps followed me down the dock, but I didn't look back. Pete, I called, straining to see if the harbor master was still sitting on the bench. He was gone. There's always somebody hanging around the docks, I thought wildly, especially during the Derby. Where is everybody? Hey, kid, I heard the big man call not far behind me as I raced past the bait shop and out the long pier toward the channel. Running along the jetty made of huge, irregularly shaped rocks, my feet didn't falter. I'd run along that jetty 1,000 times. I heard the big man stumble and curse loudly. I jumped off the jetty onto the sandy beach and headed for the dinghy. With part of my mind, I noticed that the tide had changed and was now on its way out. Grunting with effort, I dragged that little boat toward the water, which was pouring rapidly through the channel on its way to the open ocean. I could hear the plop as the big man jumped from the jetty onto the sand, and the crunch of his footsteps growing nearer. Without waiting to seat the oars, I hopped into the dinghy and pushed off. But the boat didn't float. Because of the falling tide, the water was shallower than I had thought. I grabbed an oar and dug into the sand and pushed with all my might. As the big man drew close, I could hear his harsh breathing in the still night. Come on, I whispered, nearly sobbing now with fear and frustration. Finally, I felt the boat lift free of the beach, and immediately the rapidly rushing water pulled me away from the shore and into the channel. Whew, I had a brief glimpse of the big man's arm reaching for the gunwale as I made my escape. But I didn't have time for relief. Grabbing for the oars, I fumbled in the darkness, trying to fit them into the oar locks. The left one fell in with a solid clunk, but I couldn't make the right one fit. When it finally went in, I looked up to get my bearings. I was more than halfway down the channel, being carried by the fast, dark water out into the open sea. Oh my gosh. All right, I'll see you for chapter 10.